Thank you so much for inviting me to give this preliminary talk at this exciting conference. I am particularly delighted to bring to you a perspective on narrative inquiry, and as my title says, vers une approche holistique, ancrée dans la réflexivité et le capital de vie. Two of the key concepts that will underpin my talk are the notion of reflexivity and life capital, both to make a case for the use and development of narrative inquiry. But let's first ask this question: what is narrative inquiry? Some have talked about a methodological approach or a methodology, a paradigm, an ontology, an epistemology, and even one of the most renowned narrative inquiry researchers, Gary Barkhuizen, who's also a friend of mine. That's why I take the liberty to say this. Doesn't like to take a particular stance on the definition of narrative inquiry. But recently, I was privileged enough to be asked to write a little chapter for the International Encyclopedia of Language and Linguistics, and I wrote a definition of what I think narrative inquiry is. And here it goes. Une pratique de recherche dotée d'un riche répertoire méthodologique qui nous aide à éclairer, interroger, démêler, reconfigurer et en fin de compte donner du sens à nos propres réalités et ou à celles des autres au moyen du récit ou de la création de récits. Ces deux processus impliquent une variété de modes de diffusion. So as you can see, my decision to define narrative inquiry as a research practice somehow, averts the problem of the other terms that I showed you in the previous slide. So I think of narrative inquiry as a research practice, which is characterized by a rich repertoire of methodologies or methods which help us make sense of phenomena through a variety of processes used for narrative making and narrative dissemination.
Here some of the bigger names: Karen Johnston, Paula Golombek. I have some questions. We've had some questions over the last few years. Is it that if a study says we do narrative inquiry, then it is narrative inquiry? Sometimes I've seen studies that have adopted interviews as the main method of data collection, and they say that that is a narrative study. And I've got some questions about that, because there's something more about doing narrative inquiry. It's not just about collecting data and presenting it in a certain way. It's about using the story as the epistemic mechanism around your work. A few years ago, Gary Barkhuizen and I actually put together this special issue for the journal System, where we brought together lovely people in the field of language education to answer these questions. So if that's of any interest, I would invite you to look at this. It's mostly open access on the journal. But so what are the main premises of narrative inquiry? I have to say, for somebody who works within the field of methodologies in the social sciences, I welcome all approaches and perspectives, okay? I'm very inclusive in that regard. But of course, if you decide to adopt narrative inquiry as your research practice, you got to recognize that perhaps we need to distance ourselves a little from the ideas of positivism, of post-positivism, which will normally expect a certain researcher neutrality, certain researcher stance on objectivity and detachment from the reality that you are observing. Narrative inquiry is based on lived experiences. Les expériences vécues ce sont les sources principales en fait du savoir, okay, according to narrative inquiry. So knowledge is only possible in narrative inquiry through understanding lived experiences. And to engage with lived experiences, we can't really do it with detachment, okay? So with narrative inquiry, we kind of try to move away from description of variables or broad patterns to detailed sort of understandings of complex realities or phenomena, I should say. I'm going to share some of these insights through one study that I conducted using my approach to narrative inquiry. As I said earlier, I am usually interested in the field of psychology of language learning and teaching. So the study that I'm sharing here with you, which is published in the journal Higher Education, is about the motivation of Chinese students to come and study in the UK. I work a lot with Chinese students, Chinese teachers, so this is just an example of those. And the key research questions of this study were, what was the students' motivation before coming to the UK? What happened to this motivation during, and what happened at the end of their time in the UK? A few considerations when we ask the question motivation for what? Okay, is it motivation to learn, in this case English in the UK, or is it the motivation to move to a different country, a different academic environment? And well, if we think about languages, you know, many people these days are bilingual, multilingual by nature. So, you know, in the field, in the literature, we often hear L2, but is it really L2? It could be L3, L4, L5. Now, traditionally, we have examined motivation through the use of questionnaires and experimental studies. The field of motivation in applied linguistics is about 50, 60 years old, and there's a plethora of theories thanks to all these studies that have used these methodological approaches, and that's all good. But over the past few years, some of us have asked the question whether we might change the lens, the methodological lens through which we look at motivation. So rather than looking at broad patterns, perhaps we can look at new perspectives. One of them is the person in context theory by Emma Ushioda, who clarifies that perhaps in the field of motivation, we've forgotten that when we study learners, we forget that they aren't real people, okay? Instead, studies often represent them as bundles of variables, as theoretical abstractions. So she says, with this theory, we really want to think about individuals as real people, as human being, thinking being, with their own identity, their own personality, their own history, their own unique pathways in life, with their own objectives, their own motivations and intentions. So that's the complexity of a human being, right? And so the idea is that we start looking at people in our research by understanding that there is this complexity behind each of them. Claire Kramsch proposes the ecological perspectives of research, and she says that ecology helps us encompass the totality of relations that a learner as a living organism has with the different aspects of their environment. So one way of doing ecological research means that we look at those phenomena that we are interested in by understanding the relationships between those phenomena and the context around, with so many unpredictable, unforeseeable factors and experiences. Now, the study that I'm just telling you about, I had two sort of researcher identity there. So in the first phase of the study, I was actually in charge of teaching academic literacy to these Chinese students. So it was a short 6-7 week course on academic practices for being successful in their degree. And the second phase of the study was more traditional in the sense that students did their own master's program, and I followed them in a more traditional research capacity by doing interviews and focus groups with them. Now, in the first part of the study, where I was the teacher, I was using exploratory practice, which is a particular methodology where the teacher adapts learning activities, teaching activities into research data collection instruments. And I'm going to show you some examples of data that I got from these students. So, for example, one of the questions that they had when they first started was, so what are your reasons for coming to study at this university? Describe your motivation for coming here and what you hope to achieve. And as you can see, some of the reasons why the student chose to study at this university were, first of all, because a master's is essential, necessary for their future in light of competition in society. Therefore, this is like an advantage. A master's is an advantage for a student coming from China. And also this will give the student an opportunity to get a better job in the future, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you see how the student had a specific perspective on life and society, and that's why she chose to study in the UK. Here's another one. This is a bit more interesting. So I asked them to sometimes write in English without worrying too much about academic restrictions. This is just an opportunity for them to write about their life in the UK. And this is what she said. Je me suis senti mal jusqu'à vendredi car j'ai réalisé à quel point mon anglais oral était faible. Okay, so far, students often say that. And she goes, comme le dit Gloria, un personnage de Modern Family, tu sais à quel point c'est frustrant de devoir tout traduire dans ma tête avant de le dire. Are you familiar with Modern Family, this Netflix series? So Gloria is an immigrant in the US, and she speaks wonderful English. Okay, she lives in the US, she gets by really well, but it's clear in the series that sometimes there's some interference from her Spanish, which is her main language in her life. And obviously the student says, can you see how intelligent I will probably be in Chinese, but I feel really stupid in English? Okay, and this experience was affecting the student quite deeply, to the point that it was affecting her motivation for being in the UK in the first place. I'll come back to this later in this presentation. Now, the way I do my narrative analysis is looking at the data which I collect from different sources. So in this case, it was from coursework, it was from interviews, it was from focus groups, and then put this data in a file. I use MaxQDA as logiciel pour l'analyse de données, and I put all the data for each participant in different files, and then I look at that data as much as possible. For me, the criterion of familiarity with data is when you look at written text and you can hear the voice of your participants. That for me is an indication of, yes, I'm sufficiently familiar with this data and I feel comfortable analyzing this data. This is what Phil Benson refers to as really immersing yourself into the same way of thinking as your participants. Now, unlike Benson's approach, which would be deleting anything that seems irrelevant to the research study, I think that although in this case I had a global overall interest in motivation, okay, I thought actually I want to try and really emphasize anything that the student highlight themselves, anything that they bring to the research. After doing some initial coding, again, using MaxQDA, this is just an opportunity for me to visualize where every code or thematic code is in the data, because it's a lot of data that we're looking at. Then I would start condensing all these codes for each participant into what I call thematically structured paragraphs. And each paragraph is a building block for the full narrative. Okay, so I'm basically building a story for each participant. This would, I went too fast. This is what it looks like on MaxQDA for each participant. Okay, so you got all the codes, and then for each of them, I'm writing their story. So in a way, narrative inquiry allows you to really capture the dynamics, the factors that are related to the individual, to the different social and institutional contexts where the participants are situated. In a paper that's forthcoming with my colleague Bérénice Darnaud, we are giving a bit of a close examination of the innovations of narrative inquiry for motivation in this case, but I'd like to think that it can apply to other topics as well. So first of all, one of the advantages of using narrative inquiry is that it allows you to engage with your data and really put forward the depth of the self. It's quite nice in French, actually, la profondeur du soi. And from a philosophical perspective, all of us might have more than one soi, okay? Right now, I'm a speaker, but just outside here, I'm a friend, I'm a son, I'm a teacher, and so many other things you might not want to know. And each of you also have so many different selves in your life, okay? So narrative inquiry allows us to really look into subjective experiences, in this case, the students, as they progress onto their academic pathway and really understanding what happens to their sense of self as people with such complex lives. In this case, an example is Alita, who came from China because she struggled to find her voice back in China. She thought that she couldn't be her authentic self. So she moved to the UK thinking that that could give her an opportunity to discover her own authentic voice. Another example is David, whose motivation was very much based on his interactions with his classmates, his teachers in the UK, and his imagined future self, thinking of what he would be doing back in China after finishing his work in the UK. But there were also some specific incidents, like he was actually accused of plagiarism at one point in the UK, and that experience had a big impact on his motivation as well. So these examples show that motivation obviously evolves, and narrative inquiry allows us to really capture with a certain level of detail these unforeseeable, unpredictable experiences that people encounter. So narrative inquiry therefore allows us to capture the dynamic shifts of motivation or other phenomena over time, okay, as these change in light of people's perceptions of self and the environment. And my own experience with these students is that their motivation can constantly change throughout each day on their life experiences in the UK. So you see, it would be difficult to capture all these details with a questionnaire, for example. Another experience for capturing this dynamic nature of motivation is like May, another student, who indicates that her initial motivation was connected to her interaction with teachers, which in the UK she found more interactive and which was a big contrast with her experience in China. And this helped her maintain high levels of motivation. Now, unlike other research approaches to methodology, I would say the narrative inquiry has this capacity to really highlight the dynamic aspects of people's lives, okay, particularly highlighting how the time shifts occur throughout one's unique story. And there are some strategies that the literature has talked about storytelling, story making, and narrative knowledging, which researchers may use to turn these unique experiences into coherent findings that you can then share, obviously, or can be analyzed further through more traditional approaches like thematic analysis. Now, narrative knowledging is one approach that I'm most familiar with, and I didn't translate this because it's not my definition, and I thought that by translating it, I might have killed parts of it. Okay, so let's see. The researcher is engaged. Okay, so narrative knowledging literally means la création du savoir à travers des récits, en fait. Okay, so le chercheur est engagé, okay, dans la construction du savoir, de l'apprentissage du savoir à travers les données de nos recherches. And these activities, narrative activities, they involve all sorts of processes, okay? The process of collecting the data, co-constructing the data with our participants, analyzing it, and then reporting it. So all of that is the process of narrative knowledging, constructing knowledge through story making. So in my case, and I want to highlight that it is not the only way, mine is just one approach. People are always welcome to adapt and do their own thing, okay, in their own contexts with their own unique data. But in my case, I started off with fragmented data, which then I contextualized with the aim of constructing stories about each student's motivation. And from these fragmented data, I arrived at coherent stories that had thematic sections, which, yes, highlighted the specific experiences of each individual. But at the same time, when you look at all the students in this study, you can highlight some patterns that you could argue could reflect other similar cognate students in similar contexts. This is what it looked like. I showed you this earlier. But the main thing is that for each student, there was a thematic section where I was building a narrative based on many different sources of data from different times during that longitudinal study. So, for example, in this case, Alita was the student, and you can see there's one theme that says something about before coming to the UK and at the start of the pre-sessional and so on and so forth. By looking at this narrative, I was able to highlight at the same time the individual idiosyncratic experiences of the student, like her desire to improve herself, to discover her authentic voice, but also other aspects of her academic experience, like encountering academic issues that could resonate, could be similar for other students elsewhere. So, certain analytical approaches identify these broad patterns, like narrative analysis, but I think they sometimes lose touch or neglect that rich contextual nature of individual stories. And I believe that narrative inquiry offers a certain methodological flexibility that allows us to understand complex human experiences. In a way, I say that narrative inquiry allows us to understand life more holistically, okay? And this can be done through a variety of methods of data collection or analysis. Now, pourquoi l'enquête narrative after this much talking? I think it's fair to say that narrative inquiry is embedded in the human, okay? And it clearly gives voice to individuals. Like, it's really difficult to do narrative inquiry and not, you know, highlight the voice of those who are involved in our research. A concept that relates to this, and which is very dear to me, is the idea of life capital, le capital de vie. I initially introduced this concept for TESOL, so the researching of English learning and teaching. But over the past 5 years or so, it has been applied to other areas of applied linguistics. Now, the nicest thing for me is that this concept in a way takes inspiration from Bourdieu's work. And I have to say, I've given talks about methodology and life capital around the world for the past 5 years, but this is the first time to talk about this in France, and it's a real honor to talk about this work and its connection to Pierre Bourdieu in France. So it's really nice. Thank you for inviting me to do this, actually. However, I have to say, I'm not a sociologist, and my work really takes inspiration by doing something else with it. And there's a lovely quote here, which is amazing. So about Pierre Bourdieu's work. Les collègues ont développé simultanément plusieurs types de relations avec l'œuvre de Bourdieu. Nous nous sommes inspirés, which is my case. Nous l'avons prolongé et avons apporté des corrections empiriques. Nous l'avons également utilisé comme tremplin pour ouvrir de nouveaux horizons et poser de nouvelles questions. And that's exactly my approach. My approach is to use Bourdieu's terminology as a stepping stone into something else. As you will know, Bourdieu's work, particularly the theory of capital, was engaged with understanding society, particularly understanding social classes, understanding how individuals from one social class transition to another social class, or why they couldn't. And therefore, when he would talk about economic capital, cultural capital, social capital, symbolic capital, as a way to think of the resources that allow you to be in one particular social class. But my work really moves away from this sociological perspective, and it actually becomes more of a methodological perspective. So, my approach, which is, as I said, methodological, really puts the emphasis on life stories of individual. Okay, the idea of life capital is to use it as a lens, okay, a new lens to understand life stories a bit more clearly. Now, in the field of language education research, I'm sure you're all familiar with things like interference of the L1, or manque de motivation, or il est démotivé, or things like that. And I think that life is not as black and white as this. I think that there is more complexity behind these phenomena, which is why I would like to use life capital as a lens which literally opens our eyes to individual human stories with the ability to look at complexity unique to individuals and trying to see what perhaps before we couldn't see, and that is the richness of each life story. So for me, life capital extends Bourdieu's work in terms of really going beyond understanding society and sociology of society, but really looking at stories to understand our participants' lives. They become proper research variables that helps us enrich our data and knowledge making. So life capital for me means embracing our participants' life story as part of our own knowledge making, recognizing the complexity of human being, which is made of, if you think about each and every one of you has individual memories, emotions, disposition to something, needs, desires, and so on and so forth. All of that, I think, makes each individual. And I believe that it would be useful not to forget that when we do research about people. So if we go back to this data I showed you earlier, the student who compared herself to Gloria from Modern Family, that's part of her life capital, her understanding of the difficulties that Gloria had in that series gave the student an anchor for navigating her own difficulties in the UK. So for me, understanding that means understanding the student's complex life and how she managed her motivation in this case, which was my research interest. I'm going to show you, there's one study I completed with my postdoctoral fellow, Azar Tajabadi. We just published this last year in TESOL Quarterly. We looked at the motivation of Iranian students at university, and we used activity theory as the main theoretical lens, okay? Now, according to activity theory, you usually look at subject, which is the individual that you analyze, the object, which in this case was the learning of English, and then the outcome, obviously, of that activity, and then the community, which is the people involved in the students' community of learning and teaching, and the rules of that community. But if you look on the left-hand side, yes, you see there's a whole section called life capital. Now, look how much activity theory would have left out from this student's perspective, okay? Now, in this study, we did something a little different from my narrative approach. We actually did activity theory analysis through thematic analysis, narrative analysis, and we also use something called narrative frames, which is like it's like a task that allows people to, it's like filling in the gaps of your story kind of activity. Anyway, this is just an example of how life capital as a lens, okay, bring a lot more insights that could be lost if we used another approach. There are other studies that have used life capital as an analytical lens. For example, Chris Martin looking at modern languages in secondary schools in the UK, or Catherine Sidaway looking at refugee learners of English in the UK. The next thing that is important for me as part of this kind of narrative work is reflexivity. And again, in this part of the world, Pierre Bourdieu was one of the first to talk about reflexivity. And for me, again, it's a really big honor to talk about this, which is one of my core research interests. And to do so here, it's particularly exciting. So with my good friend and colleague, Sarah Ganassin, with whom I completed this book a couple of years ago, we define reflexivity as this. So la réflexivité désigne l'ensemble des dispositions et des actions par lesquelles les chercheurs se situent dans leur propre démarche de recherche. So each individual researcher engages with certain actions, and reflexivity helps you understand how each researcher situates herself in that particular research experience, tout en prenant en compte la manière dont leur présence, leurs valeurs, croyances, savoirs et histoires personnelles et professionnelles influencent les espaces, les relations et les résultats de la recherche. So the important reflexivity is that it helps you understand how our own individual values, beliefs, and our own personal and professional histories actually shape the course of our research and the decisions that we make and how we communicate our research to others. Now, anyone can do reflexivity in the way they like. You can use a researcher journal to make notes throughout your study. You can make notes on your software to remind you of why you make certain decisions when analyzing data. You could even record yourself if you don't want to write, and then listen back to your out loud thinking. All that matters is that you take some time to think about yourself in the research and how you impact the research and how the research impacts you as well. So reflexivity is really a careful analysis of the researcher's origins, their biography, and the context and their own intellectual biases, because we all have that, okay? And I believe that it's impossible to escape those. So for me, then the remedy is recognizing them and becoming aware of them and being open about them. So I actually align a lot with John Dean, who says that reflexivity is the importance of recognizing humanity as inherent to the processes and the content of our research. Because again, if we are working with humans and we are humans, then there is some humanity involved in what we do, okay? And becoming aware of that, I think, remains important. So for me, reflexivity is actually an opportunity to celebrate life capital, both as researchers and as participants. I think that life capital, le capital de vie du chercheur, doivent être considérées comme une source d'informations précieuses, which really bring a lot of insights into our research and understandings of what we do. So researchers, in my view, are to be encouraged to bring their own life experiences, professional and personal, into their research, as long as it's relevant, of course. However, I don't propose a kind of unbridled reflexivity, réflexivité sans contrôle. I don't propose that, okay? It all has to be under control and relevant. But I think reflexivity here is an opportunity to, again, recognize, respect, and celebrate our lives as people, as researchers, as participants, and whatever other roles we have. So, to conclude, I think that human complexity is indeed at the heart of narrative inquiry. I hope I persuaded you of that. Life capital as a lens invites us to recognize participants as humans, okay, not just variables of our research. And narrative inquiry, therefore, allows us to follow the phenomena that we are interested in through the concept of time, space, and social cultural contexts. But importantly, I think that life capital gives our research ecological validity. By ecological validity, I mean that the research that we do is a reflection of the real world outside academia. So that's a big effort to conduct research that actually resembles and serves the world outside academia. Because it's one thing to write a theory, but it's another to actually talk about what happens outside in the real world. So to conclude, this is what I give you. Narrative inquiry plus reflexivity plus life capital, a humanizing epistémologie, ou épistémologie humanisante. Merci.